Hey, Slider Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Hope you had a great weekend. Thanks for being here. In this segment, we are going to strike the root of their wokeism. The guiding principle of everything that the woke believes is rooted in being anti-Christian. I will explain in this segment if you're rolling your eyes at that, and you see what you think at the end of this segment here. Here's the news story to start all this off. I've counted so far, there may be more, I've heard some people say less, I've heard some people say more, but I've counted 15 churches that have been burned to the ground in Canada. And it's not because they're spontaneously combusting on their own. What you're seeing now in Canada is a sign of what is to come here in America. There's no doubt about that. They are our crystal ball. Quick sidebar on this, actually. We're going to do a segment tomorrow or sometime this week about COVID in Canada, England, and Australia, and how unbelievably oppressive these countries' governments still are with COVID. Now, we're all British colonies. Canada, Australia, and us. We're all British colonies. But Americans, we're not subjects like they still are. We're citizens. We push back against our government more than they do, and we're better off for it. So what we see in Canada, England, and Australia is where we would be if we didn't push back like we have this last year and a half. Does that make sense? And that's just with COVID. The reason they're so far ahead with us when it comes to their anti-Christian activism is because they're just a little bit different than we are still. But what they have there is what we're going to see here. So back to these churches, 15 so far. Why? Why are people lighting churches on fire? Here's the background. In the 1800s, in Canada, the government had these boarding schools for Indigenous children. And that's where they taught the Western ways of life, et cetera, et cetera. And surely by today's standards, these were not done well, these boarding schools. A lot of these schools were run by churches. And a lot of kids died at these schools. A lot of Indigenous children died. Now, when woke people look at this story today, then they imagine in their head that these kids were murdered. This was a genocide of Indigenous children by the Christian church. But two rebuttals to that. First, why would the church want to kill these kids? That doesn't make any sense. And B, a lot of kids died back then, more so than now. There's a reason why life expectancy was so low. There's actually two metrics for life expectancy. You have life expectancy at birth, and then life expectancy once you make it past a certain age of childhood, right? So if you make it past 5, okay, well then your life expectancy is going to be much, much higher. If you make it past that. One of my favorite facts on this is James II. He was the King of England in 1685. His wife had 17 children. Only one boy made it past the age of 5, and he died at 11. And just like 2 or 3 other daughters made it to adulthood. Okay, that was 1685. All their other kids died between the ages of 0 and 2. So kids died a lot 200 years ago. And we're forgetting that. So people are finding these mass graves where these schools used to be, run by churches. And people are making up movies in their head about genocide of the Indigenous people, which is a very trendy concern today. When in reality, what these are they're unmarked graves. They're not mass graves, right? A mass grave is a big hole with a bunch of people in it, throw a bunch of people in, right? That's a mass grave. These are unmarked graves. But the reason they're unmarked is because they're from like 200 years ago. People are using this and the discovery of these mass graves as a reason to attack Christianity and burning churches down to the ground. This is the head of the British Columbia version of the ACLU. The ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union, so they have their own civil liberties union. Her name's Harsha Walia. And she was commenting on a Vice story about this. And the Vice headline was something like, 2 more Catholic churches have been burned to the ground, blah, blah, blah. And she wrote back, again, this is the head of their ACLU. She wrote back, burn it all down. Burn it all down. Why? Why would she think that? Why, when there's a story of burning churches to the ground, would she approve of it, encourage more of it? What's going on there? You go to her website or her biography on The Intercept. where she writes. And this is how she describes herself. She describes herself as a community organizer, campaigner in migrant justice, feminist, anti-capitalist, abolitionist. I don't know of what though, abolitionist of what? And anti-imperialist movements. What's missing out of that list? Right? Campaigner in migrant justice, feminism, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist. What's missing? Anti-Christian. They don't say that one out loud yet. But it fits in with all the others. It's baked in to all the others. Feminist, anti-Christian. Anti-imperialist. Well, it's those Christian, imperialist Christian missionaries and conquistadors who did all these horrible things. All of this that we're seeing today, all of this woke stuff will culminate in anti-Christian attacks. I assure you it will. How? Every Marxist movement in the world has been anti-Christian. That's part of it. They must eliminate Christianity. Every Marxist leader knows that you must eliminate Christianity because, as Jesus said, you cannot serve two masters. The Marxists knew that. They knew that you could not serve two masters. You could not serve Jesus and the government. Only one can be Lord. So God has to go. Religion has to go. Anytime you see all these woke people talk about how they're anti-this, anti-that, anti, they won't say anti-Christian, but they are. So just to help visualize this, we'll go forwards and backwards here. The goal, the end goal, is to end capitalism. They're Marxists, after all. Right? That's the whole point of this, is to overthrow capitalism. The final straw, so here's the end goal over here. End goal, end capitalism. The final straw, right before that, is to end Christianity. And the means to get there is racial division. All right? So let's go the other way. They're dividing us now based on race. That's the division. Then they bring in everything else too. Migrant justice, feminism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, whatever it is, right? It's just LGBTQ, whatever, right? All that's just division. That's the means to get to the final straw, which is the culmination of all this, and it's the end of Christianity, for the purpose of fully empowering the state to end capitalism. That's your Marxist revolution. That's the timeline. How do I know? I've read a book. That's how it goes. Now you can roll your eyes at this, as I know some liberals might be. It doesn't, and I think one reason people roll their eyes is they're like, oh, I'm a Democrat, or I know a Democrat, or my neighbor's a Democrat, and they don't want a Marxist revolution, or my neighbor's a Democrat, and they go to church. And, you know, Christians can be for critical race theories, all that, right? It's like, yeah, I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about you. I'm not talking about your neighbor or your friend who thinks they're nice and doing the right thing and wanting to help people. It doesn't take a lot of people for a revolution to happen. We're going to talk about Cuba coming up in just a little bit, by the way. Same thing with the revolution in America. It's impossible to fully say, but it's believed that somewhere around a third of the colonists were actually in favor of independence. That's a shockingly low number. It wasn't 100% of the colonists. It wasn't even 80% of the colonists were in favor of revolution and fighting against the most powerful military in all of history, right? It was only about a third. And 20% were loyalists to the crown. So the rest of the colonists were somewhere on the fence, or apathetic, or I don't really know or care. But it only took a third for that revolution to fire up. I'm sure it was the same in the Soviet Union and the Chinese revolutions as well. It's a small number of people, a small number, who have a way outsized power and influence. And they are able to manipulate and move a country of mostly sheep who really just want comfort and safety and security, or at least the illusion and promise of those things. You with me? So you may roll your eyes and be like, oh, you know, my Democrat neighbor doesn't want a communist revolution and is a Christian and just wants to be nice. Sure, that may be them. But who are they being manipulated by? Who are they being led by? Who are the people really in power here? Who are the people really controlling our culture? Who are the people really controlling our education system? Who are the people pulling the levers of power here? What do they believe? Where are they taking us? All of this bigotry is bad. But all going to be justified because of wokeism. Like, so Ibram X. Kendi, right? Henry Rogers is his real name. Ibram X. Kendi. He's the guy who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? He's the guy who said the solution to past discrimination is present discrimination. How out of your mind do you have to be to follow someone who says the solution is discrimination? How could anyone possibly think that that's going to end well? And when it does get more violent, no one is going to come to the aid and defense of white, cisgendered Christian males. Take this writer, for instance. When someone made the point that in Canada, a couple years ago, a mosque, someone burned a mosque. And the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau was all over it. Oh, it's an outrage, blah, 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 blah. And now we've had, 15 churches burned to the ground in Canada? And it's no big deal that Trudeau hasn't done anything about it. And this woman said, oh, it's very dangerous to conflate the string of church fires with violence against mosques. Catholics are not an oppressed identity in Canada. Do you hear that? Christians are not oppressed, they'll say. And because they're not an oppressed identity, you could do whatever you want. It's fair game. It's game on. Nothing bad could happen to them because they deserve it. They're not oppressed. So you can oppress them, and it's fine. They've had it coming. It's all just payback. They've been in power, and they're in power, so you can take them down. And any means are justified. You'd think people would be more wary of an ideology based on revenge. Final point, or in summary, whenever you see all these woke people say, oh, I'm anti-capitalism, anti-this, anti, what they're really saying is they're anti-Christian. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.
This past year has shown us that without your health, you have nothing. If you're not well, you can't work, look after yourself, or take care of your family. You can't enjoy the life you've worked so hard to build. That's why you need to prioritize taking care of your long-term health today, before it goes from good to bad to worse. So invest in your long-term health with Forward. Forward is intelligent medicine with a personal touch. Their doctors are dedicated to catching top killers like cancer and heart disease early before it's too late. And catching them early could save you tens of thousands of dollars in the long run. Everyone's health history is different, which is why Forward doctors personalize a health plan with you, based on your genetics, lifestyle, and biometrics to achieve long-term results and ensure nothing gets missed. It's time to invest in a doctor that's invested in you. Go to GoForward.com today to protect your future health. That's GoForward.com. GoForward.com.
Having your own home is awesome, but it's also a lot of work. The good news? Finding help for your projects is easier than ever. Introducing Angie, the app that puts all your home care needs at your fingertips. Need a pro to fix that emergency leak? Maybe find someone to build a deck, or even set your seasonal tasks on autopilot. Angie can handle all that and more. Expert pros, hundreds of home projects, clear pricing, and the easiest way to book and pay in seconds. This is Angie, your home for everything home. Download the app today.
Hey, Static Crusaders. I went to and spoke at a wonderful event on Saturday here in San Diego. It's called Let Them Breathe, letthembreathe.net, because in California, Gavin Newsom came out and said that every kid, whether they're vaccinated or not, needs to wear a mask in school next year. And that is asinine beyond comprehension. So we're suing the state and pushing back and making sure that that doesn't happen. My kid is about to go to pre-K, so it's our first kid going into school, and like hell, I'm going to mask him up before he goes inside. It's not going to happen. John Kerry doesn't wear a mask. Here's John Kerry at the Boston airport the other day without his mask on at noon Logan Airport, walking through security. And someone took a picture of him on the airplane without a mask a couple months ago. He said it momentarily slipped from his face. Meanwhile, airplanes are being delayed because people aren't wearing their mask properly. Our very own Buck Sexton was on a plane. 2 passengers said they didn't want to wear a mask, and then the flight attendants yelled at them, and then they said, okay, fine, we will. They still were kicked off the plane because they might not wear it once the flight took off, and the whole thing was delayed. There was a bill last month from Mike Lee and Dan Crenshaw to end mask mandates on airplanes, and Democrats blocked it. Rand Paul has a new bill. He says, when the Senate returns, I'll be introducing an immediate repeal of the mask mandate on planes. Enough. Time to stop this farce and let people travel in peace. This is from the Babylon Bee. State governor mandates everyone wear snorkels in case they fall in a pool. This will prevent thousands of tragic deaths resulting from people falling in their backyard pools. Science says we must do this. And the Babylon Bee says anyone who's caught without a snorkel will be required to pay a $15,000 fine or 8 years of jail. Second offenders will be shot on sight. We must do this to save lives and obey science. Obey the science. We're going to do our special on Friday. It's going to be about kids and COVID and masks and vaccines. Here's the latest study. Ready? All right. You need to know this. Be armed with this fact, as if facts even matter in this conversation, right? But if you ever encounter someone who's in favor of masking kids and vaccinated kids who is also interested in facts, that person, I don't know if they exist, but if they do, you can give them this one. This is 3 studies in England. 61 kids in England died with COVID. They did a further analysis on those 61 kids, and they determined that 25 of those kids died because of COVID. All right? The rest of those kids died with COVID, but they may have died from something, they did die from something completely unrelated to COVID. 25 kids in England have died because of COVID. Among those 25, all of them, except for 6, had some underlying health condition. So only 6 otherwise healthy kids in England have died from COVID. 6. And I would argue that perhaps all 6 of those had some other unknown issue that wasn't even diagnosed, right? But let's just go. Let's say 6 healthy kids have died from COVID in all of England. England's a little bit bigger than California. 6. This means that among the kids who got COVID in England, about 2.5 million kids got COVID in England. That's a death rate of 0.0003%. That's 3 10,000ths of a percent. Easy number to remember because it's decimal, 3 zeros, number 3. 0.003%. That's your death rate of kids who got COVID in England. I have no reason to believe why it would be any different here in America. So if your kid gets COVID on an airplane or in school, they have a 0.0003% chance of dying. You do not need to vaccinate for that. You do not need to vaccinate for that. I propose a law, if this is how we're going to live, then I propose a law where we need to ban children from eating solid food. You have a way higher chance of choking to death if you're a kid. Only pureed baby food for all children until the age of 12. Better safe than sorry. Right? Better safe than sorry. Only mushy peas for all children till the age of 12. And then from 12 to 18, we will allow children to eat solid foods. 12 to 18, you can eat solid foods, small bites, but only if they're eating alone. If a 12 to 18-year-old is within 6 feet of another child, right, then they gotta have pureed food because there can be talking and laughing. It can be very dangerous when you're eating 12 to 18-year-olds with other children. So mushy, pureed food for everyone, always. It's just a minor inconvenience. We're saving lives here. Let me jump on Delta variant for a minute. Everyone needs to knock it off. Stop freaking out about the Delta variant. This is CNN. These are all from this weekend. Delta variant's COVID-19 on steroids. Business Insider, COVID expert. Vaccinated people can still spread Delta variant. CNBC, U.S. heading for a dangerous fall with surge of Delta COVID cases. The Hill, stocks fall as fear about growth in Delta variant shakes the market. Good night. The Delta variant is no different than any of the other variants in any significant way at all. The vaccines work just the same. If you get the Delta variant, it's no worse than if you got any other variant. It's not a different thing. It's still COVID, right? It's not a totally different virus. It's, if you break it down into the molecular-ish, then yeah, it's slightly different, but it's not different in any meaningful way to us at all. It's more fit. I'm not going to do the whole analogy again, but real quick, the one we've been using is, imagine a park full of chihuahuas and you're wearing a giant protective suit that they use to train German shepherds with in the police force. And so you're vaccinated. You walk through a park of chihuahuas, you're going to be fine. If you show up the next day and the park is full of a new Pomeranian variant, you'll still be fine. Are Pomeranians different than chihuahuas? Yes, but they're both tiny yippy dogs that aren't going to hurt you. You can walk through it and you'll be fine. Maybe if you're unprotected, and you're not wearing a big suit, maybe you'll get bit by a Pomeranian. It's no different than if you got bit by a chihuahua. It's the same thing. Are you with me on the analogy? So when you see these headlines and these charts and graphs about how the Delta variant is spreading, here's what they mean. What they're saying is the percentage of people who get COVID are getting the Delta variant. But it's still COVID. It's not different. It's a Chihuahua bite versus a Pomeranian bite. It's the same thing. Let me put it like this. Let me exaggerate the numbers just so they kind of make sense. 6 months ago, let's say 6 months ago, there were 1,000 people in the hospital, and they all had the Alpha variant. So, right? So they all had the Alpha variant. None of them had the Delta variant. 0% had the Delta variant. Today, you'll see a headline. It screams, 80% of people in the hospital have the Delta variant. Oh no, the Delta variant, look how terrible and awful it is. But they don't tell you how many people are in the hospital. It's not 1,000 people in the hospital. It's 10 people in the hospital. Right? It's not 1,000. It used to be 1,000 people. Now it's 10 people. Sure, 4 of them have the Delta variant. So it's 80% the Delta variant, but who cares? You still only 10 people in the hospital. So it doesn't matter. They don't tell you the raw numbers though. They just tell you the percentage of people hospitalized or the percentage of cases. Does that make sense? And then the headlines will say, oh, it's spreading rampant in the unvaccinated community. Yeah, of course it is. But that's a smaller and smaller number of people. And then once they get it, they're immune. And that's great. This is just more panic. It's more fear for no, well, I was gonna say for no reason. It's for a reason. It comes at the exact time as Biden made the announcement that they're going to be knocking door to door to push everyone to get vaccinated. It comes at the exact same time. I forget what the exact day it was last week, like Tuesday, something. Biden did his press conference, and then Psaki came out and said that they're going to knock door to door to convince people to get the vaccine. The next day, all those headlines came out about the Delta variant, how it's so terrible, and you better get vaccinated, better get vaccinated, better get vaccinated. It came at the exact same time. Remember last week we had a guest about China, and they were talking about Chinese propaganda and how Chinese propaganda works, and all the state-owned media companies, they don't talk about what matters, they don't talk about what's important, they talk about what the government tells them to time it perfectly with their national goals and ambitions. It's the same thing here. The media timed the Delta variant fear exactly when Biden talked about knocking door to door, because they need to justify going door to door to scare people to get the vaccine. That's all that is. It's nothing different. Our local newspaper here in San Diego, the Union Tribune, number of Delta variants in San Diego County more than doubles in a week. But that's what I'm talking about. They don't give you the actual number. More than doubles from what to what? From what to what? 2 to 4? That's not a big deal. But they don't tell you the numbers. Now, I'll give them a little bit of credit. This is the subheadline. While the overall total remains small, the pace of growth provides fresh fuel for vaccination pleas. All right, so they show their hand right there. At least they give a little nod to the truth that the number is still super small, and that's what matters. Please, can we not do this again? We not do this again. But they're going to keep pushing it. And by do this, I mean don't fall for it. Don't fall for it again. I will admit, in the beginning of COVID, I listened to the wrong people. I'm not going to make this mistake again. Do not succumb to the fear and the panic that they are instilling in you. And it's because they want you vaccinated. They have this messed up obsession with getting every single person in America vaccinated, and do not think for a second that it's going to stop at knocking on doors. I saw one, maybe we can talk about this tomorrow more. I saw a flyer that they were handing out. This was in Lake County, Illinois. And they were handing out a flyer, and it was advice and tips for the door knockers. And one of them was ignore do not solicit signs. So if you're saying, it says do not solicit, it says ignore that. It says you're not soliciting. You're not soliciting. You're helping save lives. Good luck. If someone has a no soliciting sign on their door, they probably have a do not or beware of dog sign on their door as well, and they're serious about that. They're not going to stop at knocking door to door. The former head of Planned Parenthood was on CNN the other day, and she said, we need to make life very uncomfortable for people who are not vaccinated. She said, right now it's very easy to be unvaccinated. We need to make it very difficult to be unvaccinated. And she talked about twice weekly testing and signing all this paperwork and not being able to travel, not being able to do things. They're going to make it very difficult. They're going to try to scare you, and then they're going to come much more forcefully on you. This is a quote from 1984, George Orwell. This is O'Brien. So O'Brien's one of the people in the party. Right? Winston is the main character. Winston's the good guy. And Winston is being tortured in the ministry of love. You with me? The ministry of love. And he's being tortured. And O'Brien says this, in our world, there's no emotions except fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. Everything else we shall destroy, everything. We've cut the links between child and parent, between man and man, between man and woman. No one dares trust a wife or a child or a friend any longer. In the future, there will be no wives and no friends. There will be no laughter except the laugh of triumph over a defeated enemy. That's the revenge we talked about in the last segment. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. There's obviously a lot there, right? The cutting of between the child and the parents. That's our school system. Right? The no laughing allowed. The New York Times has been going after the Babylon Bee. Babylon Bee is the best right-wing satire that's out there, and the left can't have any of it. One of Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals is ridicule is man's most potent weapon. They've had Jon Stewart for a long time. They don't have him anymore. And the right has Babylon Bee, and they won't allow that. So no laughing allowed in the future. George Orwell called that. But the one I want to talk about here, or just wanted to focus on here, was the fear. No emotions allowed except fear. It's all you're allowed to feel. Because fear can be used to justify anything. The good news is, it's up to you if you're going to be scared or not. Talking about Cuba. People marching in the streets yesterday. They may be scared, but they're doing it anyway. Talk about that next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Oh man, I would trade a lot of Americans for those brave people in the streets of Cuba rising up against their communist leader there. That just happened this weekend. Popped off, at least it wasn't on my radar as something that would pop off. Brian Suits from KFI in LA, Dark Secret Place, thedarksecretplace.com for more Brian Suits. Brian, how are you, brother?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on before it's insanely hot.
That's exactly. Well, let's talk about Cuba. What are they really protesting about?
Well, it's funny. It's the conflation of a couple things, or I should say, the confluence of a couple things. They have been hit very, very hard by COVID because their vaunted free national health system was not ready for this. Can't get access to the vaccines. Certainly can't pioneer their own. Putin sure isn't flying any in. The Chinese are trying to give them. And their only prophylactic measure, their only non-pharmaceutical intervention is lockdown. And so for the phony money that they work for, they can't even get that. So they're having to stay at home, wear masks all the time. They can't. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. And it's funny that this is sort of the bar. Or okay, we've had it with communism, and it took this pandemic. But it is a confluence of a bunch of events. But what we know throughout human history, from 1918 to the Third Black Plague, is that besides war, pandemic is the number one fulcrum of all of history. And you know this is a history guy. And you're seeing it here. And if it leads to the downfall of the communist government of Cuba, then good for COVID.
The left is in a tricky spot with one of their main talking points as they celebrate the health system of Cuba. And here they are also now saying that the reason for these protests are because of the failures of the health system of Cuba. How are they going to try to spin their way out of this?
Well, remember when Castro was alive and he had his abdominal surgery, what did he do? He flew surgeons in from Spain, rather than him going to Spain. And the left was able to wiggle their way out of that, saying, well, there's always room for experts. And if you don't believe that, then you don't know anything about science and medicine and the whole thing. Same with this. They're saying, well, let's be honest. A year ago, we were in the same position, and our health system nearly was stretched to the brink, which it was not. But the panderers of pandemic panic porn had us believe, that our health system was stretched to the brink. It was not. Theirs is, because it's always at the brink. No matter what they say, it's always at the brink.
We have a tweet here. This is before Biden ever said something. This is I don't know. She's like some undersecretary of something in the State Department. If you guys want to pop it up here, her excuse. About the rising COVID deaths, medicine shortages, and we need to give more donations to the people of Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how they're definitely spinning it. What else, though, do we need to understand as Americans as the root causes of the consternation, to put it gingerly, of the people of Cuba against their communist leaders? What else has been happening there?
Keep in mind, they know it sucks in Cuba, but they tolerate it because the alternative is getting killed or thrown in jail. They're at the breaking point where they've said it's better to die in the street than live like this. And the fact that Americans who've been the number one excuse mongers for the Castro system can't be honest about the fact that it's based on terror and surveillance right now is anti-freedom. And that same official, by the way, later on last night, she tweeted, she called for calm because the titular head, the figurehead president of Cuba called for Cuban authorities, military, the civilian militia, to go to combat with these people. He said they're mercenaries and all this. And for people who don't know, the surveillance state of Cuba makes North Korea, look like Switzerland or something. It's half of Cuba is paid to keep an eye on the other half, and the Cuban G-men, or Jimenez, as they're called, that's their nickname, but they call them the G-men. They have the easiest job in the world because they go around and they hold out privilege, like a better school for your kids, or they just pay money, and that's how they get Cubans to spy on each other. And so today, last night they rounded up thousands of people. Today they're doing it still. Their playbook is right out of China. It's number one, cut off the internet. Number two, machine gun therapy. And so the machine gun therapy might be kicking off today, but that's what Burma did a year ago, or Myanmar did a year ago. The Chinese handed them their playbook, and the Chinese advisors, because the Chinese and Russians have very significant electronic intelligence listening posts in Cuba. They don't want to lose those, and so they're advising this current Cuban government.
Wow, interesting.
So by current, I mean for the last 62 years.
Yeah. So what does America do? Because now, just like it's been before, Cuba's now this little proxy war. So what do we do?
We support a freedom movement is what we do. And, and the minute the ball is in the Cuban government's court and they answer with a volley of musketry, then we make it an international issue. And, and keep in mind that the propaganda battlefield in Cuba is that literally for 62 years, everything wrong in Cuba is because Cuba cannot trade with one country on earth. They can trade with every other single country on earth, But because they can't trade with the United States, that's why your water is brown, and that's why the penicillin went bad, and that's why the corn is rotting in the field, because they can't trade with the United States, and they're playing that right now. But it's going to have to go. They have the army mobilized. The national police, they don't trust half their army. They're going to spend today probably trying to disarm half the army. And I have a source that tells me that they've alerted more dependable guys from Venezuela to come into Cuba, because the Venezuelan soldiers don't give a rip about a Cuban citizen.
Do you think this will pop off? I mean, we're a day or so into this. Do you think this will turn into something else, or do you think all the people will go back to their homes and pretend like this never happened?
Here's the bad news for freedom-loving people around the world and watching your show. It's not going to pop off. The Cubans have too much to lose. They will use live rounds, and this will go away. They have successfully beaten, really, truly beaten, the desire for freedom in 3 generations out of people. You saw people at the brink yesterday, but what did not happen is a bunch of guys surround cops and disarm them, and then take those guns and disarm cops or whatever. They're out protesting. And they're stretching their muscles, but the Cuban government is prepared to use violence. They did it last night. They'll do it today. And I hate to say it, but we don't have a president who has the will to stand up to that. It's going to go away. I'm sorry. I'm a cynic about this because I've seen it with my own eyes around the third world.
I think that's right. What a shame. So what could America do, right? Like you say, support, right? Let's say we wanted... I don't know. We're pretty war weary, right? So do we even want a nation build in Cuba, right? So what in an alternate universe could that even look like if we supported them?
But can you imagine the immediate cavalcade, the waterfall of investment if Cuba flipped, if there really was a revolution? There's no way to do it without being bloody. All I know is Cuban immigrants have been an absolute net positive in the United States. I would take a B-52 full of rubber dinghies, and bomb Cuba with them, and just make a deal with the Cuban government and say, hey, none of this emptying the prison crap, because we will throw those guys to the sharks. But if a dentist or a doctor or anybody wants to come to the United States, they're practically instant Republicans. So bring them.
Yeah, Brian Suits, Dark Secret Place on Twitter and thedarksecretplace.com. Brian, good to talk to you, brother. Thank you.
Anytime.
We'll definitely be watching that. I hope he's wrong, but I think he's probably right. The 3 generations part makes a big deal. I mean, we were just talking, and we'll talk more this week about Australia, England, and Canada, and the people there considering themselves subjects of their governments and not pushing back against COVID. It's even harder probably for people of Cuba. Very interesting. All right, we'll talk more about it. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Fauci just will not give it a rest. Here he is yesterday.
Do you think it's generally a good idea for businesses or schools to require vaccinations?
Right. I have been of this opinion, and I remain of that opinion, that I do believe at the local level, Jake, there should be more mandates.
More mandates. We've mentioned a couple times already here in California, Gavin Newsom said that all kids and adults, even if they're vaccinated, must wear masks in school next year. The madness will never stop. Drew Berquist is here, former counterterrorism officer and host of This Is My Show with Drew Berquist. Drew, how are you, brother?
I'm so good. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Thanks, man. So my concern is that Biden last week saying we're going to knock door to door, that's not the end of this eternal quest to get every single person vaccinated. So what do you think the reason is for their obsession with getting everyone vaccinated? And to what lengths will they go to get everyone vaccinated?
Well, clearly they'll go to darn near whatever lengths they need to. I mean, it's pretty crazy and absurd that we're talking about door-to-door campaigns at this point. But look, what the end game is beyond me. Other than the fact that we know and can be pretty darn certain that it's about control, and they do not want to relinquish it. I mean, think of how irrelevant Fauci would be if this all went away. And the Democrats have always been about control. That's always been their narrative. That's always been their play. So I think it very much has to do with control. And I really, sadly, don't see an end game, because you see this door-to-door campaign that's being rolled out, albeit horribly. And then you see these discussions like there of more local mask mandates, more lockdowns in certain areas. And it's just ridiculous, but they're not going to stop until people push back.
That's definitely true. I feel like maybe you mentioned two things there. Maybe there's a little nuance here. There's you mentioned like Fauci would go away if this all went away, right? So maybe there's like a human nature fame and like spotlight desire that these people always want, like Cuomo and Gavin Newsom with their press conferences every day and everyone watching, and Cuomo winning Emmys because he's such a hero on the TV, whatever. So there's fame and then there's power. What do you think is a greater force? And then what will this power ultimately be used for once COVID does go away?
Yeah, well, I think that they're obviously both very powerful things. I think power is certainly the more powerful thing. But they kind of go together, right? Because you get this, think about it, like as you mentioned there, Cuomo. Everyone's listening to me. Everyone's paying attention. And you know that he's a guy already with an ego. Just so from a psychological standpoint and an emotional standpoint, you see how that starts to grow and build and build. And then you've got someone like Fauci, who's a doctor. Doctors typically are behind the scenes. And now you're on the Today Show. You're on CNN every 5 minutes, MSNBC. You're here. And even the hate that you're getting from the right and other people who are questioning you is still relevant to you. So your head is blowing up and all this. And with that comes, in some cases, not always, comes the power. And as soon as you get a sniff of that and it gets on you, that's something you don't want to relinquish. Why give power to someone else when you can have it yourself? So I think the power is the big play here. And none of these people want to give it up. And then when you combine that with the Democrats, the current Democrat Party's goals and where they want to take this country in terms of policy and kind of the social network, it all goes perfectly together, right? Because you've got to have that to have the other.
Yeah, I see too many things coming together in a concerning way. Talk me off the ledge if you feel like it, of COVID knocking on doors. We're still in a state of emergency in California. You see the FBI saying we need to do better at spying on each other. And you're like, oh, this is weird. Where's this go?
Well, I think it leads to just, continued big government, continued overreach. I mean, what you're seeing with this door-to-door campaign, whether it's widespread or just in certain communities, it's absolutely overreach. It's absolutely an invasion of privacy. And it's absolutely, which is always the case with Democrat policies, a slippery slope. You give them an inch, they will take a mile. And they will do this. I mean, if they're knocking on doors now to ask whether you've had the vaccine or not, or to push you to have the vaccine if you haven't, what are they going to knock on the door for next? So I think that it all leads to that socialist, big Marxist government structure that they're all about and want so desperately. And again, if people allow this to happen and it goes unchecked, then it will continue to grow. And they will take that power. They will take that, oh, that worked, let's do this. That worked, let's do that. Like, it will just keep festering and growing to the point where it's so out of control that any efforts to push back will be pretty much pointless at that point.
Yeah. We got a lot more to talk about here, but let's, on this pushing back point, our last guest, we were just talking about Cuba. Cuba, it's just so fascinating to me today about what's going to happen next. Let me ask the big question. Do you think what's happening in Cuba will pop off and there will be some great freedom revolution that comes out of this and the downfall of their government? Or will they bring the machine guns out, start shooting people, and everyone goes back to their homes and pretends it never happened?
Obviously none of us know for certain. We see these uprisings happen in these countries time and time again. Not frequently as they should, frankly, but we see them happen, but they often, dissipate, kind of go nowhere, because there's too many people that, again, going back to that power struggle, are not willing to lose their power. And it's not just people there, it's people across the globe who have their fingers in the pot. So I don't see this going anywhere. I do see the second part of your statement happening. I think that there'll be some violence because you have these uprisings, and it just naturally happens. People pushing back, the government has to push back harder, and because it's a scale, right? Like, you get enough momentum as the people, and you can take this over. You can bring about change, but you've got to have a lot of people who are very willing to do that with the pain and the consequences that come with it, which are catastrophic and fatal for some. And it also is going to take support from countries like ours. Like, hey, we've got your back, push back. So there's a lot of nuance to this. There's a lot of pieces that would have to go perfectly. I see it not going anywhere, being loud for a couple days, maybe weeks. But in the end, the communist regime will win out in the end, and things will kind of go back to as they were, sadly.
What a shame. I wish we could do more. Drew Berquist. Drew Berquist on Twitter and the host of This Is My Show with Drew Berquist. Drew, thanks for your insight, man. Appreciate you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Have a good day, brother. I'm in a very contemplative, musing state about what's going on in Cuba. It's so fascinating. Who has the greater will? You have China and Russia, who obviously have great interest in keeping Cuba a communist state. They're going to do everything they can to prop up their government that's in power. And we're not. we're not going to do everything we can to support the people and bring freedom there. We just don't have the stomach for it now. What a shame for those people of Cuba. What are they going to do? How much are they going to take? How much are they going to die to overthrow? We'll see. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. See you tomorrow.